Okay, so as Rose said, if you have problems with something, let her know. And I've given a version of this talk before at the Utah Green Conference, and it's a talk I came up with actually while I was on sabbatical in Seattle 4 years ago. And I've actually done a sabbatical there, and then about 12 years ago in Oregon, in Corvallis. So I'm drawn to the Northwest a little bit, but this picture is actually in Salt Lake City, and it's almost enough to make me like a columnar tree. Generally, I don't really like columnar trees, but this one is just outstanding, and it's actually a sugar maple growing in the avenues in Salt Lake City, a nice neighborhood. So if we want a tree like this, or a tree like this is a tabletop elm, it's called. It's, I think, a type of American elm, and this one is actually at the Utah County Courthouse, a great tree. Or these Linden Plains, if we want to grow trees like this is in the Pioneer Square area of Seattle. Or these residential trees, these incense cedars on the left, and the catalpa on the right. Or this ultimate street tree, an oak, some kind of live oak, growing in the middle of the street in Solvang, California. If we want to have these trees, we've got to start with this. We've got to start with the root systems. And the root systems are the basis for the tree. They hold it up, they give it water, they give it minerals, and without the root system, we have nothing. So successful tree growing then is growing a good root system. Okay, so to grow a good root system, you need to know nature. You need to know the natural systems. And it seems like over my career, I've said something like this over and over and over again in presentations I give, that you need to know nature. And actually, no offense to people who don't have forestry degrees or forestry education, but foresters end up often, I think, in the best, with the best ability to know about trees in urban areas, planted trees, cultivated trees, because they know about natural trees. They know what grows where, how they grow naturally, and therefore they can use the natural traits that a tree has to their benefit, or counter negative problems just by knowing that. So foresters have a leg up. Not that horticulturists and others can't deal with that, but I think if you're not a forester and you haven't learned about trees in nature, you need to learn as much as you can about trees in nature. Okay, so natural tree root systems have a number of characteristics that are important. They're shallow, they're horizontal for the most part, they're wide, they form a kind of a root plate, and tap roots, if they exist, are temporary and really don't exist in mature trees. So shallow and wide. A lot of people have seen this slide if they've seen me speak before, but I've enhanced it a little. And I want you to focus on, well, let's see, I can get an arrow here. And I want you to focus on the tree with that dot on the trunk way back in the back. That tree is about 20 meters away from the person taking the photograph. And this photo then was taken in a forest, a white spruce forest. White spruce exists in northern North America, and they're a very narrow-crowned tree. The canopy or the crown of the trees maybe, let's say, 15 feet in diameter. In a forest like this, it's not very wide, maybe 20 feet. And what they did, they wanted to photograph how wide and shallow root systems are, and you see a root kind of snaking through the forest. And now I'll show you the enhanced view. And there I photoshopped it a little so you could see better. All they did to photograph this root, and this was just one woody root growing out from the base of that spruce way in the back and growing out 20 meters in one direction, so maybe 70 feet in one direction for a tree that's maybe 20 feet wide. They just peeled off the duff layer, the organic matter, and the loose needles and twigs and things, and didn't dig at all, so they didn't remove any soil from the root. That's not to say that some of this root doesn't go down into the soil. Almost certainly it does, but most of this root, and really most of the root system in a forest like this, is growing right at the surface and just under the duff layer, or if you have turf, in amongst the turf roots. So very shallow and very wide. This tree, if it has roots growing out like this in all directions, could have a root system that's 40 meters wide. And keep in mind, every one of these trees has a root system like this. I mean, where this is just one root, but you'd have multiple roots coming out from each of these trees, all laying on top of one another, woven in amongst one another, so it would really be just a network of roots. Horizontal root systems tend to be shallow and wide and have this horizontal nature, and the closer you get to the surface, the more horizontal it is and the wider it is. And this is just a photo I have of a apple tree at a place where they've done a lot of root research in England, and it shows they've suspended the tree so you can actually see the root system. It goes off the screen on either side, but you see that most of the root system is narrow or is wide, and it doesn't go very deep. The soil level would have been right about there, and most of the root system is done with by the time you get 2 feet down. Excuse my not using metric all the time. I'm calibrated better for non-metric, but metric's definitely the way to go. Again, width. This is a diagram of trees in a forest, and this, I believe, is a red maple. It's a forest somewhere in the east, 60-year-old red maple, and the edge of the canopy of this tree would probably be about where this circle is, and one root snakes out through the forest, branches and branches again, and in the farthest direction it was 60 feet in one direction, and every other one of these dots, like here and here, are the trunk of another tree. So again, very wide. And really they form what many people call a root plate, and this wine glass sitting in the middle of this platter gives you a rough idea of what the canopy of the tree, the stem of the tree, and then the root system, the general relative proportions might be. And if anything, the platter is too narrow for the size of what this tree would be. So the roots grow out wide and shallow and end up forming a kind of a plate that we actually sometimes see in nature, when a tree blows over, this is some kind of conifer on the left, and it's blown over, and the trunk is much smaller than what you're seeing here. These are the roots that were flaring out from the base of the tree. And this spruce on the right is at a grade school that, again, it turned up that plate when it fell over. So I think it's a useful illustration to think of it as a root of the root system as a plate. Okay. So tap roots, a lot of people focus on tap roots, talk about tap roots with trees, and there are tap roots that you can find on young trees like this one. This looks like maybe an ash, and that's definitely a tap root. But this is within probably a year and a half of this tree growing from seed, and once you get some age on a tree, these tap roots start breaking down. Basically, the root system goes somewhat deep quickly and then goes laterally, goes sideways from then on. And tap roots in old trees would be really rare. And root systems are like this, wide and shallow, and lots of interlacing roots, because that's what roots need and trees need to survive. But roots in particular need oxygen, water, and minerals. And all of those materials, certainly oxygen and water, in most cases are most available at the surface. Oxygen, definitely, water, usually, and minerals, usually, are all available in greater abundance near the surface. So you get what the roots can, you get the root system that these conditions set up. So that's how roots grow in nature. How do we then take advantage of our knowledge of that to grow a good tree root system, possibly not in nature, where we're trying to grow roots in a yard or a commercial area? Well, again, we need to follow what we learned from nature. And a few things I've thought of that sometimes come up as inadequate are the plant material, the quality of the plant material. You need good plant material and good root systems to start with. Then you need to do quality planting and site prep. You need to occasionally do maintenance for the tree that affects the root system, and that has to be done well. And then you may need to do repair occasionally of the root system, the root collar in particular, and we'll talk about each of these. So good plant material and roots. You need a tree and a root system that's alive. Hopefully that's a little bit a given. You need a root system that's wide enough. You're going to be transplanting a tree, unless you grow it from seed, that most of the root system has been cut off, but you can, there's a rule of thumb for getting a wide enough root system from the nursery. You need a well-formed root system, and you want to avoid potted or containerized trees for the most part, and buried root collars. And then you need to take into account species and site compatibility. So live roots, I put this picture in here just to remind me of this development I was asked to come look at in the west part of the Salt Lake Valley, that a number of these trees, you can see the ones behind that sign, were failing, and they looked odd to me because they had really slow growth even though they had just put them in the ground. And typically it's the next growing season where you'll get really slow growth. This was, I think, in August, and it turned out that when they got the trees in, they put them on an asphalt parking lot and then tried to keep them adequately watered and had them that way for an entire year. So they maybe got there in, let's say, March or April, and they were there for an entire year, many of them were, and were finally planted in late summer of the following year. So the trees had a lot of dead tissue just from being held that way because it was a very hot area and really hard to keep the trees adequately watered. And then they planted them with all their root system packing materials still on, including cords around the trunk, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. You need a wide enough root ball or potted tree if you're going with a containerized tree. And the rough rule of thumb that's used in the industry, and this varies for conifers versus broadleaf trees, but it's roughly, you want 10 to 12 inches of root ball diameter, so that would be the outer two arrows, for every inch of trunk diameter near the ground line. So that'd be the inner arrows, and that's called the branch collar, or the trunk collar. So if this is a 2-inch diameter tree, you'd want a root ball that was 20 to 24 inches in diameter. And I do occasionally see root systems that are inadequate in width, and you've left even more of the root system in the ground than you needed to if you do that. This is not a bad diagram of what a root system of a tree might look like. And if you dig a deep hole like this, which I could imagine some people thinking might make sense because you want to, sometimes you hear about mirroring the top of the tree with the root system, and so going a little deeper might make sense to people who don't know what we all know, which is that root systems are shallow and wide. And instead, this would be a better root ball, maybe not going quite as wide, but going, or as deep, but going wide. You need a well-formed root system. And we did a root washing and planting workshop a couple of years ago, and we got in a container, bought a containerized tree. This was in a large plastic pot, and took it out of its pot and realized it had so many circling roots that the chances are we were going to end up with this, what's pictured on the right, and this entire surface was just solid roots, mostly growing horizontally. Now, I think there are ways you can deal with that, and I don't know that I'm really going to go into that in this talk, but I'd much rather see planting balled and burlapped trees that lose a lot of their roots. I mean, the potted tree, you haven't really lost any roots initially. The problem is where the roots are is a problem. But with the balled and burlap tree, you are digging a tree in soil in a nursery, and the root system that it has inside this ball is going to be fairly natural, natural as much as roots growing in a nursery can be natural, and you'll get a more natural spreading root system. You may end up actually having less root mass, but the root mass is distributed better, and you're much less likely to especially have problems later on where you end up with circling roots that then can become girdling roots and kill the tree. So I much prefer balled and burlap trees or bare root trees to container grown trees, given how trees currently are being grown in containers. There are some new systems out there that are better and for growing containerized trees. Even so, though, an additional problem with containerized trees is the fact that often they don't use soil in the media that the tree is potted in, and I think this can be a problem later on when that stuff starts to decay and go away, and the tree has got to get its root system out into the surrounding soil to be successful. And then species and site compatibility. You want tree species that are well adapted to the site and especially the soil conditions you've got. And we see 3 oaks here. I'm not sure. These might be English oak, Quercus robur, on the left, and they're doing much better than the Norway maple on the right. This is probably partly due to soil pH. Our soil pHs here in Utah are generally quite high at low elevation sites, and Norway maple, the tree on the right, usually doesn't show chlorosis till the pH is fairly high, but it's definitely showing some here. Plus, it's got some leaf scorch. The tree on to the right that you're just seeing off the screen there is, I think, maybe a red maple, Acer rubrum, and it's not doing well at all. So try to select trees that are compatible for your site. Okay, so besides good plant material, we need quality planting and site prep. And that involves having an adequate rooting volume that the roots can possibly grow in, a wide, shallow hole, proper depth, which means at or above grade, the grade it was planted at in the nursery, grown at in the nursery. Remove packing materials, backfill carefully, use no amendments, and have no surrounding root barriers. Now, this adequate rooting volume section is a little tedious. It's just numbers and words at first, but I want you to really, I don't know, if you're going to take any notes, take notes on this, although we will post a recording of this webinar on our website later today. But I dug around, I guess that's kind of a pun, I dug around to find out what research that's been done out there has said about how much rooting volume a tree needs, or how much rooting volume you need to grow a certain size tree. And what I came up with were these 2 ways of looking at it, and they're consistent not only with research studies I've found, but also consistent with reality. And so you want 60 to 120 cubic feet of soil per inch of trunk diameter, or 1.5 to 2 cubic feet of soil per square foot of crown area. Okay, so think about that. Well, for one thing, a cubic foot of soil, it's got to be high enough in the soil, shallow enough that the tree's going to be able to use it, and it's got to be in pretty good shape. I mean, this assumes a fairly well aerated soil. It wouldn't count if you had a lot of rock in it, so you'd have to add some cubic footage if you had a lot of rock. If it was very compacted, again, you might need more cubic footage. So to give you an example then of a few of the studies I looked at, Perry, who used to be at North Carolina State University and has some great root research out there, great publications, scientific publications, came up with that a 20-inch diameter tree needs a 40-foot by 40-foot volume. He didn't really say how deep that would be, but depending on your assumptions, it comes to about 80 to 120 cubic feet of soil per inch of trunk diameter. And by the way, on larger trees, that trunk diameter would be measured say at 4.5 feet above the ground. So Perry's finding was in keeping with these figures. Another figure from Nina Basic at Cornell University, Nina developed structural soil that we'll talk about in a bit, is 2 cubic feet of soil per square foot of crown area. So that is consistent, of course, with the 1.5 to 2 cubic feet per square foot of crown area. And James Urban came up with about 1.5 cubic feet of soil per square foot of crown area, or 60 cubic feet per inch of trunk diameter. So he's a little on the low side, the low end. And that 1.5 to 2 cubic feet of soil per square foot of crown area. So just imagine projecting the area of the canopy of the tree to the ground, and then you'll want enough soil volume so that you could go down 1.5 to 2 feet all around, and that would be enough. One problem with that way of looking at it, the crown area way of looking at it, is it's not going to work so good with like that first tree we looked at, that columnar sugar maple, because it's a pretty big tree, and yet we're going to use a small crown area because it has a columnar crown. And then Urban also mentioned having parking strips at least 4 feet wide, and that's certainly something we often have to deal with. So another couple of illustrations of how reality seems to fit with those figures. This is that apple tree we looked at earlier, and I just measured this based on the photograph and came up with that maybe it has about a 6-inch trunk diameter. And if you estimate the root system diameter and the depth of the root system, I come up with about 16 inches or 16 feet root system diameter and a 2-foot deep root system. And when you multiply that out, it comes to about 400 cubic feet for a 6-inch trunk diameter, which when you divide comes to about 67 cubic feet per inch of trunk diameter. So with this tree, it works. That's rooting volume in terms of cubic footage you'd like, and then the rooting volume has to be, as I mentioned, has to be accessible to the tree and good volume so that the roots actually can grow out into that. I don't want just soil volume or road base volume. I want volume that roots can grow in. And so
Mike, this is Rose. Can I interrupt and ask a question?
Sure, go ahead, Rose.
Okay. This is a question that's relevant to rooting volume, so before you move on into something else, I thought I would ask this. Can trees in one planting area share this soil volume?
Yes. I don't know that I've seen research results accounting for that, and I would tend to think that, well, by sharing the soil volume, I assume he means you could grow one tree in, say, 90 cubic feet of soil, or you could grow 2 trees in the same 90 cubic feet of soil, or 3 or 4 or 5. I'm thinking that probably you would need to add volume, maybe not equal amounts of volume as you add trees. It's going to depend partly on how complementary these trees are, or shrubs that you grow in around the trees, how much turf you have, because turf can be quite competitive for the resources that the soil is giving the tree, especially water. So you're going to need more volume as you add more trees. But if you add a tree that's less demanding, then it's going to be on the low side. And if you had a tree that's more demanding, it's going to be on the high side. So maybe a gamble oak, maybe isn't going to be real demanding, but you put a Norway maple in that same volume, it's going to want all the volume that you can give it. So you need more open ground rather than less. So paving can be a problem. If you have paving, using porous pavers can be good. Pavers that either the paver itself is porous and can let oxygen and water through, or at least there are joints that allow that material to move in. And then you can use structural soil even over fully compacted road, you can make fully compacted road base out of it. We'll talk about these. The photo on the left are trees doing very well, being grown in probably with structural soil, and there are these large pavers. They appear to be maybe 1 foot by 2 feet. This would be in kind of North Washington, D.C., and these trees are doing well. Oh, and then the trees on the right are in islands in St. George City in Utah, and I'd be happy to know if somebody knows how those trees have been doing. You have to wonder with that island on the right whether the soil volume that might be available way down at the end of that island there would be very available to these trees. It might be over time. It certainly wouldn't be at first. So porous pavers, these actually aren't pavers that are porous, but these are bricks laid in sand probably, and these trees are doing very well. These are in Omaha, Nebraska, downtown, and the trees are growing, not being limited by the pavement they're in much, and it's a good situation. If you want to pave, if you need to pave, say using concrete sidewalks, certainly streets, driveways, an option is to use structural soil, and the classic structural soil is CU soil. They would just as soon we only use the term structural soil in referring to when we refer to CU soil, and that stands for Cornell University soil, developed by them, patented by them, and now the patent, I think, is owned by, or at least managed by, I've got the name of the company at the end. And basically, structural soils are a combination of sharp angled rock up to maybe a little over an inch across. Sharp angles are important because when you compact this, you need soil volumes that are created as the sharp pieces bridge over one another. If you had stuff that was too variable in size, and that's another thing, you don't want a lot of variation in size with this, because if you had smaller and smaller and smaller material, it would fill in the gaps that you need to have for roots to grow in. And so what you've got is angular stone, fairly even in size. Let me get my arrow again. And filled with soil in between, and this would be like a silt loam soil. And they actually use a sticker of some kind. I think it's probably a polyacrylamide gel that I'm guessing only is there for the initial mixing of the soil. You basically mix this at a yard where maybe concrete is made and where they're going to deliver this stuff to you. And they mix the soil, the rock, in exact proportions with the sticker in there and keep it a little bit moist, and then they take the stuff to the site and put it down, and you can compact it to full compaction for concrete pavement, but there are still gaps in there with soil in them that roots can grow through. This has to be limiting eventually to the success of this tree. And you couldn't possibly grow the same tree on this site with structural soil that you could without structural soil, with good access to a well-aerated, non-compacted soil. But it may be better. It may be the best you can do. I just as soon people do designs that don't rely on having trees in the middle of pavement. I probably need to hurry up a little more. Try to get this done in an hour with some questions. You want a wide, shallow hole, and obviously that's to reflect the fact that you're going to have a wide, shallow root system. And this is kind of ridiculous, but it makes the point that wider is better, and only as deep as the root ball is high. And if you think about it, you could dig a small hole, put a tree in the middle of it, and then till all the way around the tree as far out as you want. That's essentially what you've done here, and that would be fine. You want a prepared, well-aerated area as wide as possible for those roots to grow horizontally into. You want proper depth. A lot of trees still coming out of nurseries are being grown at or prepared when they're moved. They end up with buried root collars, and buried root collars kill a lot of trees, both early on when they're first planted, but also later when you end up with girdling roots. Need to remove root ball packing materials. I don't see this as much as I used to, but I still see it quite a bit. And in fact, this is that development in the west side of the Salt Lake Valley, what some of the trees looked like, where they hadn't removed anything and hadn't even dug a wide hole to have backfill. They didn't backfill these at all. They just eyeballed the size and shape of the hole they needed and then dropped the tree in. No amendments at planting time. Rarely would you need to fertilize at planting time. Trees are really good at surviving on low nutrient conditions. Water is what I'm illustrating in the picture on the right. Water is the main amendment you need, because that's what the tree's going to need to survive. And then organic matter and vitamins and things like that, you really don't need. I'm okay with organic matter if it's really well composted and you have a very poor soil. But most people, when they say they have a really poor soil, it's really not as bad as they think for trees. Like clay isn't that bad for trees, and it has some benefits. No surrounding root barriers. Root barriers ignore the needs of the tree. The tree's got to have that soil volume to grow into, and root barriers like this stuff shown up in the upper left, ignore that. That's the material that was used in the two pictures on the right, and good for the tree. The tree's actually figured out how to get roots over the root barrier. You can see that in the lower right, and probably had deeper mulch at one time. The roots grow through the mulch and jumped over, and the tree's showing the people who did this what it actually needs, as is the London plane on the left in a parking lot in California with a panel type root barrier system, and it's just jumped right over it. And I say good for the tree. Good maintenance. You need good maintenance to maintain a good tree root system. and that includes irrigating appropriately, mulching. I like 4 inches in depth and maintain that depth, and no fertilizer without symptoms that tell you it needs fertilizer. So irrigating appropriately means moistening the soil as deep as the root ball is high or greater, and use a probe if you need to. If you don't have too much rock in your soil, you can actually use a long screwdriver, or you can rig something maybe with a T-handle. There are actually probes made for finding buried drain tiles, things like that, that you can buy, and they have a rounded tip to them, and you just push them in, and when they hit dry soil or dry sand, they'll stop, and that way you can calibrate your irrigation system so that you know how deep you're rooting. You need to extend the irrigation as the tree grows. As it gets bigger, it's going to need more water. And I actually had a person call me about a tree that I looked at here, and they were being told by the person that they bought the tree from that she was being told that giving the tree 5 gallons a day would be way too much water. This was a 15-foot high blue spruce grown on a southwest facing slope in a very hot location, and he told her that that 5 gallons a day was too much. And I'll tell you, that tree needs, that's the beginning of the life of this tree. Already it needs more than 5 gallons, and large trees can actually use 100, 150, 200 gallons a day. Some trees actually can use that and need it. Others can use it but will survive on less. But you need to know the species and know what it needs. Don't saturate the soil for long periods because you'll kill roots. They need oxygen. Most trees we grow need 20 to 40 inches of water a year based on their natural needs, and most of that needs to come in the growing season. But at low elevations, snow typically doesn't amount to a lot of moisture for the tree anyway. But you need 20 to 40 inches a year, and a tree that is more water loving might actually use even more than that than it would on its natural site, because our sites are hotter and drier than where many of these trees are grown. Like little leaf linden growing in Europe wouldn't be exposed to the low humidities and high temperatures that it's exposed to in Salt Lake City, and let's say it gets 30 to 35 inches in England, it might need another 30 to 50% more to do well here. And so you need to know your species and how it's adapted to dry sites and the ability to withstand dry conditions and then come out of it when things get better. Some trees can do that, some can't. Blue spruce is a great example of a tree that if you cut the water back on it, you're going to have a significant possibility that it'll get attacked by insects, and you could lose a large spruce tree quickly if you don't give it enough water. Mulching, I like mulch like that on the right, or the mulch blowing being done on the lower right. Mulch volcanoes aren't good. It's not a case of if a little is good, a lot is better, but mulch should be renewed regularly, and if your mulch stays wet, I would remove it from around the base of the tree so the tree can dry out. Yeah, you really don't need to fertilize at planting time. I've said this before. And repair. Sometimes you get compacted situations where you need to do aeration and vertical mulching. You can also do root collar excavation, and then you may need to do construction mitigation to keep root systems healthy. This is a workshop on the left that I was at in Minnesota and spoke at, and this guy was doing a demonstration of root collar excavations with an air spade, which is just an air gun with a nozzle attached to a compressor, and he could bear off the root crown, I'm blanking out here, the trunk base quickly, and if you were having problems, say with girdling roots or thought you were, you can do a root collar excavation, that's the term I was trying to think of, and quickly determine what roots need to be cut. You could also use this to do radial trenches out from the tree, like the diagram on the right, in a compacted area, and then fill back in maybe with compost or something. And this person on the right's doing more laborious core aeration. Aeration only will work if you remove material. Systems that go in and inject air and fracture the soil don't really work because the soil will settle right back down. You need to remove soil and replace it with something to hold it open. Root collar excavation, I think, would be a great thing for people to sell as a service and to know how to do if you're institutional or with government. I'd like it if you do root collar excavation commercially, indicate that in the chat pod. I'd just like to know if people are doing that. And it's to fix buried root collars, girdling roots. You can use an air spade. I don't have one, so in my trees at my house, I've used hand tools and a shop vac, and it allows you to find and then prune girdling roots. Many trees need this, and you need to look for unexpected gradual decline, little or no root flare, trunk going straight into the ground. The trunk perimeter, as it's reaching the root ball perimeter, if you have this decline, often that's when the girdling roots are starting to kill the tree. If the tree's planted too deep, it's more likely you have this problem. And then if you have a lot of fill over the root system, it's more likely you have this problem. And this is a tree that had girdling roots that I cut years ago, and this root just erupted after I cut some girdling roots. And I worried about it, but I thought it was okay, and actually the tree came out of it for about 12 years, and I think this root was a large part of the root system that was absorbing water and minerals. But that when I exposed it here, I realized it was starting to girdle a root that is going like this. So there was a flare root here that's huge that was starting to be girdled by this tree. And I then have undertaken to remove that root. I cut it there. It's attached to the tree on its right side, and I actually was using the spade here to pry this up, and you can see the piece I broke off there, here, and this is the crater it was making, but still there's bark there, so I think it'll heal, and that's where I cut it. I had to be very careful not to do great injury to the tree, and I'm hoping that next year this area here starts to grow quickly, its annual rings, and we'll have some new life on this tree because it has started to decline again. And I think it'll work. On the other hand, I've done this kind of thing with Norway maples and not been successful with one yet. But this was a little leaf linden, and I think it's been successful before, and it will be again. This is a Norway maple with girdling roots, and this is that guy doing the root collar excavations. A a lot of people wondered why this American elm wasn't doing well, and it turned out when this shrub bed was put in on the right, they actually cut off about a third of the root system of this American elm to put in this edging, which just makes no sense at all. And this is just some girdling root removal. But that's a Norway maple, and that tree has not yet come out of it. Construction mitigation would be you need to protect roots during construction and root collar areas. You need to do what you can to facilitate growth of the root system and of the tree while construction's going on, and then regrowth afterwards. And try things like careful excavation if you need to excavate near a tree, meandering pavement, rubber sidewalks, porous pavement, structural soil. So careful excavation, this is not that. And you really need to be on scene to be able to guarantee good excavation. This tree was actually fell over in a storm in the following year after these roots were cut. Meandering pavement, this didn't gain a lot with this tree, but every foot you can move away from that tree before you have to be cutting large woody roots, you're better off. Rubber sidewalks give you flexible solutions, rubber panels with steel pins to kind of hold them together and to help with situations like this. And on the lower right, they've actually meandered the pavement as well, but these are rubber panels. This is a rubber sidewalk. I want to finish up quick, but if you can root prune, if you have to root prune, the farther away, the better. And several studies have shown that if you can go 3 times the diameter of the trunk, diameter at breast height, or farther, you can increase the force it would take to pull over that tree or blow it over by 7 times compared to if you do your root pruning at the root collar. And so try to avoid cutting buttress roots at the trunk at all. Cutting just one of those can reduce the pullover force needed by 12%, and cutting half of the buttress roots can reduce the force by 30%. So it's much more likely the tree will blow over or fall if you cut close. And just going 3 times the diameter of the trunk out or farther can help a lot. So avoid this. I think I'll skip the examples. We actually saw several of these examples. And Rose, we can do a few questions. Let's see, there's some questions here. Somebody says they find that Google Street View can be pretty handy for checking on trees. Yeah, it would depend on how recently they've done your city, but yeah, if it's current, it can be. Somebody says the trees down the St. George Boulevard are doing great. Those were the trees we saw earlier. The soil was amended with 10% Nutrimulch to a depth of 2 feet. Nutrimulch is a combination of bark, I believe, and parts of turkeys, maybe, and some manure. And the Chinese pistache trees pictured are now about 10 inches in diameter, and pistache is a really good species. When is the best time of year to root prune an established tree? It would be best early in the growing season when it's cool and moist, and especially if the trees don't have leaves on them, that would be best. Late summer would be the worst. And is it a good idea to aerate street trees after a construction project? I guess, yeah, if you have an area you can actually aerate. Lots of times with a street tree construction project, you're you've got pavement put back and you can't really do any aeration underneath it. But certainly if you have an open soil volume that you can manipulate, then doing aeration would be a good thing. Thanks.